Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Maine State Chamber's webinar that's titled Understanding Pine Tree Power. Our goal today, with your help, is to separate fact from fiction, promises made as well as reality possible. Hi, my name is Dana Connors. I am the moderator for this important webinar, again, brought to you by the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, and we're pleased that we can do so with Lanice at Central Aroostook Chamber of Commerce. How soon we forget when we're not in that position, but being at home, I'm going to correct it again, Central Aroostook Chamber of Commerce. We're going to be looking today with the help of our distinguished panel and with your questions, we're going to be looking at Pine Tree Power, ballot question number 3. And we hope to be able to unpack the issues, the impacts, the problems associated and impacted on our state, our economy, our taxpayers or ratepayers, if question 3, Pine Tree Power, were to pass. That is our intent for today, and we hope that you will participate with any question that you have or any concern that's on your mind. Before we introduce our panelists, it is my pleasure to give us a welcome from the State Chamber of Commerce, the new president and CEO of the State Chamber. That person is Patrick Woodcock. Many of us know Patrick because of his experience here in Maine, as well as his experience in Massachusetts. In Maine, he was key to Paula Page's administration, and in Massachusetts, as we all know, to Charlie Baker. In both instances, he distinguished himself in the area of energy, and how appropriate, considering how important it is to the state of Maine as it is to most states today. Energy is one of those top priorities. So Patrick, very proud, very pleased to welcome you and to offer you the opportunity to tell us where is the State Chamber on this issue, as well as the sponsors who bring us this opportunity today. Patrick?
Well, thanks very much, Dana. I appreciate that introduction, and it is wonderful to be returning to Maine and working in this capacity. I think energy is at such an inflection point for growth right now. As a state energy official for 2 states, I have seen this moment as an incredibly busy period, both meeting affordability goals, implementing the largest federal investment in energy and generations, and furthermore integrating new technology. It really is an incredible time to be working in energy, and certainly look forward to bringing the Chamber on board for its partnership with Maine businesses, with the legislature, with the Mills administration. To your question, Dana, and I think you outlined it well, this is one of the more critical issues for the Chamber right now. I think it's been articulated by a number of our state officials that know this the best, of the open questions, the lengthy duration of how this referendum could affect the implementation of our Inflation Reduction Act, and be a distraction for some of the core issues that are affecting Maine businesses. The Maine Chamber is vehemently opposed to the referendum. We have major questions about how this would be implemented that I think we'll get into today. But I did want to thank you for leading this important topic for the Aroostook Chamber. And I will turn back to you. I did want to thank our sponsors who have contributed to this event, and want to thank them for making this event possible today. So I'll turn back to Dana to lead with the run of show and introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and we all look forward to working with you, as you so eloquently stated, on this very important issue for the state. It is now my pleasure to really introduce or present to you our distinguished panelists. The first is Jim Cohen, who is a partner attorney for Verrill Law Firm, and Charlotte Warren, who is an owner and principal of C. Warren Consulting. They are both with a group called Maine Affordable Energy, which is really a ballot question committee opposed to question 3, Pine Tree Power. And on the screen, you can see a link for Maine Affordable Energy, which is a diverse coalition made up of large and small businesses, organized labor, trade associations, and literally thousands of individual Mainers. We have also included a link to the ballot initiative itself. Now that you know our panel, let me talk a bit about today's webinar, how it's going to work. We hope it'll come across as a conversation because we know that's the best way to remove the formality and to get your input. But we'll also be asking our panelists, both Jim and Charlotte, what we can expect to be voting on in November for question 3. And then we'll ask them to talk about some of the high-level issues involved with Pine Tree Power or question 3. With that, and after that, we'll turn it over to your questions. And to help in that regard, I want to introduce our technical moderator, Peter Close. Peter is a part of the Maine Affordable Energy Coalition. He is a deputy chief of staff as well as administrator for the coalition. And to make sure that the webinar is doing what we want it to do for your purposes, I'm going to turn it over to Peter to explain just how you all can get your questions before us to get answered. Peter?
Thanks, Dana. Really appreciate the introduction, and thanks, Jim and Shar, for doing this today. Having a question asked is super simple. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. I ask if you have any question, please drop it into the text box there, and we'll be able to see it and bring it up for Jim and Shar to answer. If you would also like to ask your question live, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll do our best to try to get to you as questions are coming in. If you are brought on live, there is a lag time between us raising you up to a panelist. So I'd ask that you just please wait a moment while that loads in, and we'll get to you as soon as possible. And I'll also be putting instructions for the chat box again, for the Q&A box in the chat box momentarily. So you should be able to see all of that in just a quick second. But yeah, it should be pretty simple, but thanks so much, Dana.
You're more than welcome, Peter, and thank you. While you're thinking about what questions are on your mind, as I stated earlier, we'll begin with some of the high-level foundational pieces, if you will. And Charlotte, I'm going to ask the first question of you. Can you tell us what will be on the November ballot in terms of the language and so forth?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dana, for the question, and thank you for having us. And Peter's going to put up the slide for us, or Jim is going to put up the slide for us with the language of the question. So there's the question, and I'll tell you a little about what it actually means. But do you want to create a new power company governed by an elected board to acquire and operate existing for-profit electricity transmission and distribution facilities in Maine? What's important to know is that although that's one question, it's backed up by a 15-page document, right? And so I'm going to talk to you a lot today about what's actually the policy, right? And so the proponents of question 3 are asking all of us to take a really huge gamble and something that's never been done at this scale anywhere before. They want us as the state to take over 2 utilities that are not for sale. So we're talking about forceful acquisition. We're talking about eminent domain, years of litigation at a cost of $13.5 billion. And there have been some questions about that cost. So let me just be clear. We say $13.5 billion. The proponents say $9 billion or $10 billion, depending on which forum you're at. And the public advocate is also using those same numbers, that we're looking at somewhere between $10 billion and $13.5 billion. So we're talking about billions of dollars. And then question 3 will elect a board of politicians who have no requirement of experience or skill. They will then appoint people without legislative approval. They will appoint folks to this board, and then that board will hire a private operator. So similarly end up in the same place we're in now. They talk a lot, the proponents of Pine Tree Power talk a lot about the evils of for-profit ownership. What's interesting is they've put for-profit ownership in their bill. So just, it's another example of they're making a lot of promises that they're not going to be able to keep because they didn't put it in the language. We'll talk more about that, but that's what it's asking us to do. That's what we're going to vote on. If you say yes, you agree with that premise. If you say no, you don't think it's a good idea to take over private businesses by eminent domain and guarantee all of us a large increase in price to pay for litigation, huge debt to buy out these companies, and an elected board to then run our grid. So that's a little bit about what we're voting on.
Actually, you probably have addressed this, but I want to circle back for a moment because when we think of the Maine Affordable Energy coming together and being able to attract a number of businesses, associations, and individuals, while I think you have addressed this in just about all aspects, summarize what brings you to this issue. Why are you so concerned about it?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Dana. A little bit about my background. I'm a social worker and an educator in the state of Maine, and I'm also recently retired from 21 years of public service. I've been a planning board member, a city councilor, a mayor, and I served 8 years in the legislature. I currently also serve and have for the last 8 or 9 years as a trustee of the Greater Augusta Utility District. I know a little bit about how the state works, and I know a little bit about how utilities work. And I am extremely fearful about what this means to our state. This is a very consequential vote. From my personal perspective, government has a lot on its plate right now, and there's a lot we're not doing well. And I've had an inside view for a very long time. I don't say that as, as someone that doesn't have experience. I have serious concerns about that. I have serious concerns that what the things we should actually be doing, right? Electricity rates in Maine are too high. We need to be tackling that. People need relief from that. This proposal does not do that. This proposal goes after something that is 20-something% of our bills, right? So the rest of the bill is unaffected. So yes, there are things we need to fix, but I've always been someone who wants to match up the proper solution with the problem. And in this case, unfortunately, although well-meaning, it does not do it, and it's very dangerous.
Very well said. For a person that we all have come to know as somebody that puts people above politics, you certainly are that individual, and your advocacy for social justice is without question. Actually, I want to turn to you, Jim, now, and I would ask that I've got a question for you in terms of, let's say that question 3 passes, Pine Tree Power gets its way. What can we expect? And I would ask you also to if anybody on this particular webinar has ever had an energy or telecommunications issue, I'll bet Jim Cohen's name comes front and center in every occasion. But I'd like to have them know a little bit more about you, as Charlotte has spoken about her background, her commitment. I'd ask the same of you.
Great. Thanks, Dana, and good to see everyone here today. As Dana said, I've been working in the energy and telecommunications area for over 30 years. I'm a partner with the law firm Verrill Dana. And in that time, I have represented solar developers. I have represented consumer-owned electric and water districts throughout the state. I have worked with utilities as well on the investor side over the years. I practiced before the Public Utilities Commission. I also practiced before the Maine legislature and the Energy and Utilities Committee for just about 30 years. And in my private life, I served on the City Council of Portland for 6 years. I was mayor for 1 year. And I have served on the board of the Maine State Chamber. I'm a past president of the Portland Regional Chamber, as well as a past president of the Portland Community Chamber. So the issues that are involved in question 3 are issues that I have seen from all sides, both as a politician, from the consumer-owned side, the investor-owned side, and the local side. And I've been involved in this particular issue for 4.5 years. And during that time, I have studied, researched, and am thoroughly convinced that question 3 would be a risky and dangerous idea for the state of Maine. So we've listed some of the key issues that we think voters should focus on, being a decade of legal process and litigation that we should expect. As Charlotte mentioned, $13.5 billion in taxable debt to take over CMP and Versant, a revolving door of for-profit private grid operators who would earn an additional $82 million a year in profits, who could even be CMP and Versant all over again, that this proposal puts 100% of the financial risk of running our utilities on Maine consumers, that it would create an untenable regulatory structure, because we're being asked to vote on a structure. And we're going to talk about that structure. And this has never been done before. And we can talk about that as well. In fact, it's important to note this model that we're voting on, only 2 utilities in America have that structure, and it's Long Island Power Authority and the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, both of which are models that have been unsuccessful. In Puerto Rico, they're bankrupt, and they measure outages in terms of months, not hours or days. The other thing, and I think Charlotte touched on this, is there have been a lot of promises about what Pine Tree Power would do, but it's important to understand, and I think Charlotte said this well, there's nothing in the bill that will improve the quality of our electric service. There's nothing that would lower our rates, nothing that would improve our environment. And the public advocate said as much in the statement not long ago. This bill would not get rid of for-profit companies, and it wouldn't look like any of the small utilities we have in Maine already.
Jim, you touched upon this, but I want to go back to it as we wrap up this section and get to our questions that the audience participating today may want answers to. And that is, you touched upon that the precedent. There's not really other states that have really been successful at this. You mentioned Long Island, I think Puerto Rico, but at the local level, there are some that have experienced what they term as successful efforts. And can you talk a bit about that? Because it's used by those who support Pine Tree Power pretty repeatedly, and it can be misleading if you don't hear Paul Harvey's the rest of the story.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And we should set aside some time to maybe walk our viewers through the mechanics of how question 3 would work. Mm-hmm. But let's focus on what our electric system looks like in Maine. And this is a map of all the different electric utilities in Maine. 97% of Mainers are served by either CMP or Versant Power. Those are investor-owned electric companies that are in Maine. And as Shar said, they are not for sale. The proposal would be to forcibly take them over by eminent domain. There are also just under a dozen what are called consumer-owned utilities, meaning that they don't have shareholders. 4 of them are small municipal departments. They serve portions of communities: Kennebunk, Madison, Van Buren, and Holton. Very good small utilities, and they are geographically quite dense. They look very different from CMP and Versant, but it's important to understand that even though those 4 have lower rates and better quality of service, they also have very few miles of territory to take care of. So when you're talking about number of customers per mile, that's very different than talking about miles of line per customer. And the larger the territory, the more likely you're going to have outages, the more expensive it is to serve. So that's one key difference. The second is, even though those 4 small municipal utilities have better service and lower rates, there are 4 other island-based utilities, Idaho, Fox Island, Matinicus, and Monhegan, also consumer-owned, that have higher rates and worse quality of service. So just because you're consumer-owned, it doesn't mean that your rates are going to be lower, that your service quality will be better. In fact, there's only one utility in Maine that is consumer-owned that bears any resemblance to CMP and Versant, and that's Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative. It's not a government entity, so it will be different than Pine Tree Power, but it is consumer-owned. Their service quality has been worse than CMP and Versant. It's also rural. Their rates have been comparable to CMP and Versant. And then there's huge differences between what Pine Tree Power would look like versus these consumer-owns. And we touched upon how there'd be a private grid operator that would charge more. None of these consumer-owns have a private grid operator. None of these consumer-owned utilities even have large transmission lines, which are costly. None of these consumer-owned utilities pay taxes, unlike Pine Tree Power and unlike CMP and Versant. None of these consumer-owned utilities are required to provide some of the environmental requirements that CMP and Versant do provide, like net energy billing. So all of those adds up to higher costs that CMP and Versant have, that Pine Tree Power would also have, and none of these consumer-owned utilities in Maine have them. It is truly an apples to oranges comparison, and we would expect that under Pine Tree Power, we'd have higher rates, worse quality service, as well as a model followed by only 2 other utilities in America.
Jim, I'm glad you brought to my attention that I obviously didn't give you time to answer one of the other issues that really needs to be shared, and that is what happens next. Let's assume that Pine Tree Power, for the moment, God forbid, but let's assume that it passes. What then?
Yeah, and it's important to understand, and Shar touched on this, we're voting on a structure. We're not voting on a utility, we're voting on a structure. It's like a charter. So I served on a charter commission in Portland a decade ago, and we made an incremental change to our charter. The voters of Maine are being asked to set up a different system, and it's a system that, unlike the upper right-hand corner of the slide, which is basically a public utilities commission appointed by the governor regulating CMP and Versant, we would be creating this new entity called Pine Tree Power, if this referendum were to pass, that would in turn be governed by the the seven elected board members, 6 appointed by them, a staff, and then hiring this private for-profit company, that unique model. And here's a timeline of how it would work out. So we'd be voting in November, and let's just say we said yes in November. The first thing that 35-page bill would require is that a year from now, we'd be voting on the trustees, those 7 people. So if we then elect them, they would start their service in January of 2025. They would in turn have to bring on board the 6 appointed members. So now we have a 13-member board. Their first order of business is to figure out how to take over CMP and Versant. It is not optional. The bill requires it. That takes at least 18 months according to the bill, and it could take longer. So now we are well into 2026. Well, what happens then? Well, the bill contemplates that an offer is made to CMP and Versant. Now, they've said they are not for sale. They've also said they think that their property is worth many billions of dollars more than the advocates of question 3 say. It is virtually certain that there will be litigation over this. Our public advocate several weeks ago said expect 5 to 10 years of process. In Long Island, which I mentioned earlier, there was no litigation, and it took 13 years. On average, these takeover processes take 10 years. And I can tell you from personal experience that once these things end up in the courts, they do take years. I worked with 2 small water utilities in the mid-1990s, one in Rangeley, one in Winter Harbor, where the legislature created a district, and they gave that district the right to take over 2 private companies. Each of those small water utilities went to court over the value of their assets. That litigation in each case took 3.5 years. Magnify that statewide, magnify that by billions, magnify that by having 2 companies, not just one, and realize that litigation has gotten longer, not shorter, in the past 25 years. 5 years is probably a conservative estimate. So we're now in 2031. That would be the first time that we would know how much CMP and Versant are worth. So what question 3 asks us to do is in November of 2023, write a blank check to take over CMP and Versant. And not until 2031 would we know what we're filling in for that check. We think that number is $13.5 billion. It's like going into the car dealer and saying, I want to buy a car. I have no idea if this car will run or not. I have no idea how much it costs, but I'm going to take that car. And in 5 to 6 years, if you could please just send me the bill and whatever it is, I'll pay it. That's what we're being asked to do with question 3. At that point, we know the value. We go out to bond. We're paying billions of dollars in taxable debt. We're now in a deep hole, a financial hole that we're climbing out of for decades. And we'll be hiring this private grid operator, and we don't know who it will be. We don't know for sure whether anyone will come forward at all. Public Utilities Commission did a study in 2020 and said, this is a big risk. There are not many private grid operators out there, and there's a chance that we might not find one. So we're looking at 2033 before conservatively we're flipping the switch to some new grid operator. That's a very long time. In the meantime, our climate action plan from the governor comes and goes. We're not thinking about reliability. We're thinking about who owns the grid. And all the lawyers and all the consultants who are going to be fighting over it, all the bureaucrats at Pine Tree Power, the bill says we pay for 100% of those costs in our rates, and that will be tens of millions of dollars over years that we will be paying before any switch is ever flipped.
Well, that's an excellent overview on behalf of what I refer to as a distinguished panel, and you know why I refer to them in that way, because you have been given a lot to think about here, today, but now it's your turn. We want you who are listening today to have the opportunity to ask what's on your mind. What are the questions or issues that you would like to have Jim or Charlotte to address while we have you with us? Peter, do we have any in the chat room?
Just give it a moment for people to pop in there.
For every vacant space, I'll fill it up to get it given more time for people to put forward their question or concern or idea. And let's talk about that 13.5 billion. It gets repeated over and over. And we know that cost, as both of you have indicated, is a cost in terms of what the ratepayer or the taxpayer has to address. We know it has an environmental cost as well as a political cost, putting people in charge that are elected without credentials. But how did we get to the 13.5 billion? Because the other side is saying, oh, that is way too high. And I've yet to see their numbers and numbers justified. So how do we get to 13.5 billion?
And I think it's interesting. Jim is going to give you the actual math, but let's just talk about the proponents for a second, because it's interesting that the proponents are hesitant to talk about the cost. They have a couple of times, when forced, admitted the cost will be 9 billion or 10 billion. Last Thursday, a week ago, in a debate, the campaign manager, Al Cleveland, stated that they don't know the cost. At the public debate, that's League of Women Voters, everybody can look at it. But then the next day, their campaign put out on social media all about how much savings. Well, we all know how to do math. And if you don't know the cost, you can't know the savings. It doesn't work that way. So it's just another example of unfortunate, disingenuous information we're seeing from the proponents. But Jim can tell you how we got to that figure.
Jim?
Yeah. And Char, that is really important. It's also important to know that the starting point for any analysis of costs goes back to a study that was commissioned by the Maine Public Utilities Commission at the direction of the Maine legislature through legislation passed in 2019. And a consulting firm called London Economics International was hired. They studied the takeover because the legislature said, there's way too much going on that we don't understand. We need to try to understand it better. London Economics helped us better understand what the costs might be, but they acknowledged there were many unknown variables, and any one of those variables could make this be extraordinarily expensive or very inexpensive, and everything in between. What they said about the takeover cost is if you use their midpoint of their assumptions, they said if the takeover occurred in 2024, it would be $8.2 billion. So only $8.2 billion. And they also arrived at that. If any of you have ever done an appraisal before or been part of an appraisal, you try to figure out the value of a piece of property, you want to know what did comparable pieces of property sell for. And so in the utility world, where there are very few sales and purchases of utilities, the way it's done is through a multiple of book. You look at the sale of some utility, and it has a book value and a purchase price. And that purchase price will be a multiple of the book value. So what London Economics said is, we're going to assume that it's 1.5 times the net book value of CMP and Versant. That's the starting point. But we looked at the timeline earlier. The takeover will not occur in 2024. In fact, London Economics analysis was done 3 years ago. And every year that passes, new wires, new poles, new substations get added, which increases that net book value. So when you go out to 2030, now you're talking a much more valuable set of companies that we're taking over. The other important thing is that net book value multiplier. If you look at the 3 most recent takeovers of utilities, and these are very, very small utilities, nothing like this has ever happened on the state level, their net book multipliers were between 2 and 5 times net book value. So you just simply plug in those 2 variables, time and net book value, and that's how you get $13.5 billion. It is entirely based on the analysis done by the PUC with those 2 variables changed. If the takeover occurred in 2031, that number would be higher. If the net book multiplier is higher, it will be more than 13.5 billion. This is one of many concerns we have about question 3 and Pine Tree Power.
Yeah, we do have a question that comes from Lenice. Thank you, Lenice. And it speaks to the first part is one that we'd all like to know the answer to. And that is, what's the probability of the no vote being successful, or in the reverse, Pine Tree Power having their way? And the other part is one that has received a lot of publicity, and we're very pleased, and that is with the governor's position relevant to this question. So either of you want to take that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'll give you my personal worry. I think that the utilities have been so demonized that I worry, that people are going to take a vote thinking they're going to see some sort of change that actually isn't in the bill. It's not possible, right? It's not related to the language. I think we've got to get everybody to go out and vote. When I talk to people about this proposal, sometimes I tell them, what are you thinking about this? And they literally say to me, you got to be kidding me. That's what they want us to do? And it's like, yeah, that's what we're going to vote on. So we need to make sure that people get to the polls, that people actually turn out and vote. That's, my big concern is that nobody takes this for granted and that we get out and vote no. The interesting thing is that our current governor and our former governor are in complete agreement on this proposal. Both Janet Mills and former Governor Paul LePage both oppose this proposal and have expressed that they would vote against it. I have the statement from Governor Janet Mills here in front of me. She did a radio address on September 20th, so last month. And there are all sorts of pieces that she highlights, but I think, this part is interesting, where she talks about the cost. Question 3 will cost Maine people as much as $13.5 billion in borrowed money. That's more than the entire biennial budget for the state of Maine. And can you imagine the interest payments on $3.5 billion? The cost alone leaves me concerned that we are proposing to mortgage the future of our children who are going to have to foot this bill years down the road. And so we started thinking about that, interest, right? The proponents talk a lot about how they could access low interest loans, right? So let's say they can. Let's say we're talking about 5%. And let's say we use their number of 10 billion. We're talking about interest payments of $500 million a year. That's just interest payments, right? And so, the governor is right to be really concerned about what this is going to cost Maine people and how long people are going to be paying this off. And thank you, Peter put in the chat the link to the text of her radio address if folks are interested in checking it out.
Jim,
there's no question. There's no question that this is a campaign. The voters of Maine are being asked to decide what could be one of the most significant issues ever voted on when you think about the importance of electricity to our lives, the billions of dollars involved, and the fact that every corner of the state is affected. And I agree with the governor that this is one of the most significant issues we've ever voted on. And so it is really important for each of you and each of our friends and neighbors and family and coworkers in Maine to get educated. Because it is a campaign, there are ads. That's part of the way education has to occur in a statewide ballot question. And forums like this are so important to help educate voters. But because it's a campaign, every side is doing polls. They're testing messages. There's no question that the proponents of Pine Tree Power have decided that their winning message is to keep voters focused on any little problem with our utilities today. And what they don't want to talk about is what we're actually voting on, which is question 3. They don't want to talk about the fundamental change in our electric system. They don't want to talk about the $13.5 billion in costs. They don't want to talk about the fact that they would be adopting a system that only 2 other utilities in America have opted. Those are losing messages for them, and they don't want to talk about them. So we're talking about them today, and we would encourage all of our listeners to continue to get educate and to encourage your friends and neighbors to get out and vote.
Yeah, there's a couple of, Peter, unless you tell me otherwise, I don't see any additional questions in the chat room. And hearing none being raised from you, I would ask quickly that we address another issue that seems important, that we don't want to get lost in the debate. And that is, I hearken back to words of advice given to me time and time again, and that is, an initiative, a proposal, an idea without a plan is nothing more than a wish. Well, in truth, I'm not hearing anything about a plan that addresses how they're going to get to where they want to be, how they're going to address climate change issues, how they're going to invest in the grid to be sure that our renewables have access. What is your reaction to that?
I think it's a great question, Dana. And if you look at the proposal, again, I'll hold it up. If you look at the 15-page proposal that's behind, the question that we'll vote on, the promises made but not represented in language of the bill are, there are no requirements in this proposal for lower rates. Let me say that again. There are no requirements. There's no language in the bill that's going to require lower rates. There's no requirement for better service. And there's no requirement for more renewals. There's optimism that they're going to elect the right people that all agree with all of those initiatives. And those right people are then going to do those things because, and this is what they literally said at a debate 2 nights ago in Bangor, because the company purpose is in the bill. I mean, the company purpose says this is what the company is going to do. So that's what's going to happen. Well, unfortunately, optimism is not a plan, and that's not how it works. It could work if they got all the people they wanted elected to the board. It could work the way they want. That's a pretty big risk for us. And it's just not in the bill. And all of us here have spent enough time working on policy to know that if it isn't in there, it's not going to happen. So Jim can take it from there.
Jim?
Yeah, thanks, Shar. And I think one thing we all need to step back and think about is we are voting on a new structure. And both Shar and I are recovering politicians. That's part of our democracy. But what we're also mindful of is not every system works best under that structure. And when this proposal came forward, there were a number of former Public Utilities Commission chairs who came out and said, we're really concerned about this because we observe that when utilities don't have shareholders and they are entirely owned by consumers, our ability to regulate them goes down. our ability to impose penalties goes away because there's no one to penalize. And there's no one left to pick up the pieces if everything breaks. And that's concerning. And it's important to look at examples of, let's say, a storm occurs. We had a storm last Christmas, and Central Maine Power spent $53 million of their own money, shareholder money, to get the lights on. And they did it well. They did it twice as fast as expected. About 3 weeks ago, Maine's public advocate came out and said, well, CMP actually restored power twice as fast as expected. They should have been slower. And because they did it faster, they shouldn't be able to recover that $53 million. Now imagine under Pine Tree Power if there was an overspending or bad action. Who would be responsible for that overspending? There are no shareholders. It would be us. At the same time, what about those politicians who are deciding, should we turn the lights on faster in 4 days, or should we let people have no power over Christmas and New Year's because it's less expensive? That's a decision that could be made. And those Public Utility Commission chairs were concerned that political decisions might lead to underinvestment and less responsiveness to consumers. We've seen that in Long Island, one of those two examples of a separation between a government-controlled utility with a private grid operator, where there's been found to be a disregard for consumers. So these are the things that we should be concerned about. We all may recall in Texas several years ago, there was unexpected ice, and there were extraordinary costs. Those investor-owned utilities were literally able to weather that storm and the financial storm, but the consumer-owned utilities were placed on credit watches by Moody's because they didn't have the balance sheet to get through that storm. And one of them actually went bankrupt. And right in our own backyard, Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative went bankrupt because they invested in Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant. And because of cost overruns, they couldn't afford it. They went bankrupt. They had no shareholders to absorb those costs. So those consumers spent decades paying off the creditors because they didn't have shareholders. So this is a structure we're voting on. And it's a structure that is extraordinarily risky for every Mainer.
As the hour draws to a close, and before I make final comments, there's one other issue that I would ask that we quickly address. And that is, I happen to believe that we have outstanding service in Versant and Central Maine Power in terms of providing us the transmission and distribution portion of our charge. But they often get labeled when it comes to increases with a total package, when it's not the case at all. It's a very small percentage in terms of the overall rate increase or the overall cost. Speak to that quickly so that we do separate fact from fiction. And I think it's important for people to once again hear that there's generation and then there's transmission and distribution. And we're not talking about generation, but the bill simply can imply both when they talk about rate increases.
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly. And first, everyone has experienced their electric bills going up tremendously in recent years. And those orange bars represent the supply portion of our bill. CMP and Versant have not been allowed to own or sell electricity for over 25 years. So that orange portion of the bill has nothing to do with CMP or Versant. It has nothing to do with Pine Tree Power. Whether it passes or doesn't pass, the rate increases that we recently experienced would still have occurred. The next piece is, what does that mean for reliability? Well, it turns out that 87% of outages are caused by trees. Maine is the most densely forested state in the nation. So it stands to reason that trees will cause outages. The icing that we have from our position on the coast adds to that. 82% of those trees are outside of the right-of-way. So whether it's CMP or pine tree power, it doesn't matter. Those trees will still be there. They'll still ice over. They'll still fall on lines. But when you look nationally, municipal utilities like those small ones in Kennebunk, yeah, they're really small. They have better outage data. But the really large ones like that Eastern Maine cooperative I talked about, nationally, those large ones have worse outage performances than investor-owned utilities. And here in Maine, Central Maine Power has better outage performance than Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative and better than some comparable utilities like Eastern Maine in New Hampshire and Vermont. So does Pine Tree Power lower our rates? Does it improve our service? Our public advocate came out and said, there's nothing in the bill that mandates that happens. And based upon more reasonable analysis, we think the opposite is likely to happen, that the politicians are likely to underinvest and that the $13.5 billion hole we dig, plus the new management fees, that's a burden we don't dig ourselves out from under.
Well said.
Yep, could I just, yep. Dana, I'll just add, Jim does such a good job at giving us all the data and the facts. And now I just want to bring in like the common sense Mainer perspective, right? Like, let's just use our common sense. You can't take on billions of dollars of debt and immediately see a reduction in rates. Doesn't work that way. Everybody has said, you will see upward pressure on the rates if this is to happen. At the beginning of this process, you will see upward pressure. So that's just common sense. But secondly, let's think about service under this proposal. So we have two separate companies that have two separate entire systems, proprietary operating systems, different buildings, different territory, different workers. We're going to take those two systems, cram them together, and expect to get better service. So while all that cramming is happening, right, there's a lot of unknowns there. Who's doing what? Who's running what? What system are we using? Who's the boss now? All of those pieces. I heard somebody describe it as it's like trying to take two bicycles, fit them together into one while riding down the road, right? Because the other thing that we have to remember is that for people with health concerns, not having electricity can be life or death. Not having a place to store your insulin, not having the machines that you rely on in your home that are part of your healthcare plan, that's when this issue becomes really, really, really serious, right? More than a lot of the other pieces that we've talked about. But for many folks, and for definitely folks that I've talked to as I've been out knocking doors in my years of doing this service, this is a life or death service, electricity and access to electricity. And so just to use our sort of good Mainer common sense, there's going to be a severe disruption in the service that we get. And that just, you don't have to be an economist or an energy, expert to figure that out. It just takes common sense. So thank you.
Well said. And my friends who have joined us today, I thank you so much for your participation, our panelists are second to none, and our sponsors for being able to bring this to you today. Today, you've heard the facts that separate it from fiction as well as promises made. And you also know why we are united, all of us that you've heard of earlier, against this proposal. It is extreme experiment and one that we cannot afford. It is, as the governor said, we are mortgaging our children and our grandchildren if this were to pass. It is full of risk, it is full of cost, it is full of uncertainty. I hope you will join us. If you're interested, please go to our website, Maine Affordable Energy and be part of the coalition. If you have any questions or want to write a letter to the editor expressing your opinion, please do so. Most of all, it's important that we not take this for granted in spite of the facts telling us why this should be voted down, why question 3 is not in the interest of our customer, of how organizations should be run, be it political in nature, or certainly our environmental interests. There is nothing that we can say that will help grow our state and everything that will hold it in place, if not put it in reverse. But most of all, please vote. It's less than a month away and your vote will count. With that, as they say in show business, that's a wrap. And I thank you for your attendance.